Fighting continues in Sudan for a third week amid a hopeful sign that negotiations may be in the offing. Hello, I'm Mike Walter sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. As fighting continues in Sudan, the United Nations top envoy in the country tells the Associated Press that the two sides have agreed to negotiate potentially in Saudi Arabia, first and foremost on achieving a stable and reliable ceasefire. Several temporary ceasefires over the past week have eased fighting in some areas, while fierce battles continue in other parts of the country. According to health ministry figures, more than 500 people have been killed, some 4,600 wounded since fighting erupted on April 15th. And on Monday, the UN said more than 800,000 people may flee Sudan into neighboring countries. And the UN World Food Program warns the violence could plunge millions more into hunger in a country where 15 million people were already in need of aid to stave off famine. There's a lot to talk about. Let's get right to our panel. Ali Verji is a researcher at the University of Gothenburg School of Global Studies and a fellow at the Rift Valley Institute, an independent policy center focusing on Eastern and Central Africa. Nimat Ahmadi is a survivor of the Darfur genocide that began in 2003. She's currently the founder and president of the Darfur Women Action Group. Also with us, Abdullahi Boro Halaki. He's an Africa security and policy analyst. And Letitia Courtois is the International Committee of the Red Cross Permanent Observer to the United Nations. And Letitia, why don't I begin with you? 8 tons of medical aid from the International Red Cross arriving in Sudan on Sunday. It's the first time since the fighting broke out. We're told, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 16% of the hospitals in the capital are actually operating. A lot of them have been shelled. Just talk to us about how important this vital shipment is.
Thank you very much for having me. Indeed, the ICRC has managed to bring a first shipment of 8 tons of medical items that are essential to treat the wounded, the injured during the fighting. But this assistance is yet to arrive to the hospitals, where it will be used and put to use for life-saving purposes. And so far, it is yet to happen. So it is a first step that will probably help a lot, but nonetheless, that is definitely not to the scale of the needs right now. The country has been direly impacted in its medical capacities. 16% of hospitals are functioning in Khartoum, and many of those medical facilities are simply overwhelmed and require either personnel or supplies to be able to keep treating the people that require this assistance. So it's very dire. It's a critical moment where more needs to be brought in, not just by the ICRC, but also by all the humanitarian actors, and humanitarian space needs to be upheld so as to allow this assistance to reach the structures where it would be put to good use.
Letitia, as you mentioned, dire. Just how dire? Well, the UN says the humanitarian situation is reaching a breaking point. Let's listen to UNICEF's Chief of Field Operations in Sudan. This is Jill Lawler. Let's have a listen.
We know that ahead of this crisis, over 15 million people were in need of humanitarian assistance, and that included 8 million children. All the aerial bombardments, the attacks on facilities, the attacks on water infrastructure, the destruction of vital vaccine, that figure is going to go up.
And she went on to say that even before this crisis, about 610,000 children were being treated for severe acute malnutrition. In other words, without treatment, they'd be on the brink of death. I mean, you're talking about the challenges of just getting this first shipment in. We talk about just how dire things are. Kind of give us a scene setter, just how bleak are things?
Well, the situation is very, very dire indeed. It's a complex humanitarian situation that has been going on for years in Sudan. We do have years of past conflict, violence, communal violence, leading to insecurity, but also numbers of wounded. We also have years of economic hardship be it due to the global environment with access to food, inflation, but also to the capacity for people to maintain as well their basic income and culture as well whenever they could to feed their families. It's been very difficult to sustain people that have been impacted by those situations. In the past, we talk about almost 4 million people displaced internally in Sudan, and most of them being in Darfur. And this is definitely another layer of vulnerability that comes on top of the very harsh reality of those people. The medical facilities and I would say the essential services were very stretched from the onset, and destroying and damages further those structures when they were on the edge is definitely putting them in a very critical situation.
Abdullahi, these are really two separate stories. The humanitarian toll, which is ballooning out of control, but the other story, of course, the chaos, the fighting, the violence that we're seeing as well. The numbers, the health ministry saying 528 people have died, 4,600 wounded since the fighting erupted in mid-April. But the UN believes the toll is actually much higher, and really there's no way to gauge this, but we can tell you that the former Sudanese prime minister says this conflict could deteriorate in one of the world's worst civil wars. Is he on the money there, do you think?
He is on the money, but I just want to step back and say there are potential three outcomes, if you will. One is, a peace deal that brings, the parties to a talk, and then we start having all other processes. The second one is one party subduing and defeating the other party, and then, establishing de facto state and all the apparatus of the state. And the third one is really the one that I'm worried about, is the potential for these to fracture into a protracted conflict. Sudan is, before even this particular round of conflict that started 2 weeks and plus now, was always under tremendous amount of the numbers that you've quoted. It's just the laundry list of all the bad numbers that you can quote. Food prices have been going up. 2/3 of the people who rely on agriculture, particularly in the rural areas, the prices of food has gone up, and so a lot of people are already, at the breaking point. So when this comes, it magnifies all the problems that the country has. And I just want also to just highlight that, I'm sure you'll be coming to it, is that, Sudan also has this distinction of being a refugee host country, but also a country that generates refugees. So now there are three options that could obtain as a result of that. People, new displacement of Sudanese going to the border countries, for instance, Chad. And these are not countries that are renowned for being, stable politically, economically, and socially. So you are adding more layers to that. And then there are people who are now saying, look, we've sought refuge in Sudan now. Sudan is unstable and they are leaving. And there are people who are already in Sudan now looking to go to other countries. So you are looking at multiple crises and multiple fronts, not just in Khartoum, which now is the center of gravity, but increasingly what we are witnessing is that conflict metastasizing, going back to places like Blue Nile and Kordofan and Darfur. I think I just want to end by, highlighting Darfur. You can draw a direct line from Darfur 20 years ago, unresolved crises, to where we are right now. Both Burhan and General Dagalo, the two protagonists, cut their teeth in Darfur. Their history, their rise to prominence and power is written by the blood of Darfuris who still are waiting for accountability. But the problem is, instead of that, historical crises and, injustices of Darfur is being resolved, we are adding a new layer. The number of refugees inside Chad, 400,000 of them are from Sudan, but mostly from Darfur. We've added 20,000, and the list goes on. Some of them could go to Ethiopia, some of them could go to Egypt, which is a very difficult border.
Abdullahi, I want to come back to your three options in a bit, but I want to give Nimad a chance to respond to what you just said, since you were there, you saw what happened in Darfur. Give me a sense of what he just said, whether or not you agree with him.
Well, it is indeed, I agree with him, and the situation is really dangerous, as the situation in Darfur has been going on for over 20 years. It's almost 22 years since the start of the genocidal attack in Darfur. And as of right now, I think the situation is not being reported as it is expected to be because of the reality that is being created. Many areas in Darfur has been completely cut off, no access to communication, internet, phones. Like the information that is coming right now out of Darfur is coming from a few places. You can say 20% of the Darfur areas where Al-Fashir, Niyala, and Al-Junaina recently. Look at the attack in Al-Junaina. 200 people have been killed. Many more have been wounded. Hospitals were bombed. People, their homes were burned completely to the ground. Government institutions. There is allegation of poisoning of water. People are cut off as of now with no access to any kind of humanitarian crisis. Those who are able to flee to Chad, they fled, but many more remain. They are still in the city, and many of the wounded were unable to receive emergency assistance. Similar situation in other areas. In Al-Fashir, both the hospitals that are expected to receive people are in close proximity to the military headquarters where people were bombed and forced to evacuate. Then now there is a small hospital, local hospital in the southern part of Al-Fashir, whereby it's completely lacking anything, including like the minimum first aid supplies in the hospital. So right now, young people are taking into their hand trying to go and donate blood to this hospital. But if there's no ceasefire, it will be nearly impossible to aid. In Niyala, the same thing. Humanitarian aid buildings and offices have been looted, market, banks, many other institutions. So the situation is extremely dangerous right now for those who are on the ground in Darfur. It's equally bombing and shelling,
Right.
including shelling of hospital last night in Khartoum. So you can imagine how the situation.
Well, that brings me back to Abdullahi. You mentioned the three options. Obviously, the one option everybody would like to see is a negotiated settlement. There are talks at the UN saying that the two sides are willing to send representatives possibly to Saudi Arabia to try and maybe hash out some type of agreement. What are your thoughts on that? Is it likely? What would the contours of some kind of agreement look like?
Thank you so much, Mike. I think we have to, I need to make it very clear from the outset. If the talks that would lead to General Burhan and General Dagalo being in charge is the kind of discussions or the peace agreement that is being sorted out, the status quo ante of having General Burhan and Dagalo is not feasible in the medium and long term. What Sudanese want is a return to the civilian that has been agreed on. But between these two, they are not going to resolve a problem. That's one thing. I think the contours of an agreement has to take a few shapes. Number one is a complete cessation of hostilities. Because what is making the humanitarian situation incredibly dire as we speak is, number one, the targeting of humanitarian space and humanitarian individuals makes it incredibly difficult for them to deliver humanitarian aid, especially in hard to reach, but in this case right now in Khartoum. Number two, I think there has to be an unimpeded humanitarian access to not just Khartoum, but all these places. When a third of your country or the citizens are in need of humanitarian aid, when acute malnutrition, particularly of children, is through the roof, it's higher than the global average of 15%, then you have serious problems. As long as there is no accountability at command and individual level as far as Sudanese egregious human rights violation is concerned, we will have this conversation then again and again and again. We can get into the debates of, who has a leverage over which faction and which group. But I think, once we have cessation of hostilities, once we have an unimpeded humanitarian access, accountability by all means necessary at command as well as at individual needs to be on the table, and without which I think we will be having this similar conversation a few years down the road.
Ali, let me have you join the conversation. Give us a scene setter. I mean, he kind of did a little bit of an overview. I mean, you've got this leader of the SAF and then the leader of the RSF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, and the Rapid Support Forces. At one time working together, now both of them struggling for power. Talk to us about that. How did we get to this point? And then the second option he talked about, where there might be a clear-cut winner in this. Do you see that happening? And if so, which one of these leaders might emerge? And is there the possibility of what he's discussing, which was what we saw kind of years ago, where it seemed like there was all these protests, and we thought perhaps there'd be a democratically controlled government, and then, of course, it descended into what we're seeing today?
Well, Mike, let's remember that, as you said, these two men were on the same side for quite some time, not only to overthrow the former president, Omar Bashir, but also in the war in Yemen, also in Darfur. So taking the decision to embark on this cycle of violence was not something that they decided at the outset. It's something which has happened relatively recently. And for that reason, I don't think we can expect it to disappear very quickly. Unfortunately, both sides have been quite intransigent in what they've said, and they seem quite committed to continue fighting no matter what their commitments or pledges to the international community might be. So what brought us here is not only, though, this rivalry between these two individuals. I think it's important to realize that the Sudanese state has long been dysfunctional in terms of what it has done to its people. And the Sudan Armed Forces has been at the forefront of many of the abuses over decades in Sudan. The Rapid Support Forces, of course, is a more recent force, but its genesis is entirely in the war and the genocide in Darfur. And so these institutions have a long history of repression, of brutality, of violence. And that isn't something which they simply shed by cloaking themselves in the language of democracy and freedom as they are trying to do now. So I think, unfortunately, it'll be very difficult to get them to back down and to change course. It seems like they are very much committed to violence.
And Letitia, bodies are there in the streets of the capital. In fact, the International Committee of the Red Cross Africa Regional Director Patrick Youssef told journalists the Sudanese Red Crescent is trying to get the bodies in the streets. Where does that stand right now? I mean, when you look at these challenges, I mean, you've talked about it, just getting supplies there, and then you stack them on top of each other, the humanitarian needs just ballooning. Give us a sense of these bodies in the streets. How do you remove those, and the potential as we look forward to just how catastrophic this could be?
Yes, indeed. As Patrick has mentioned, the Sudanese Red Crescent volunteers have been doing a tremendous job from the onset of the flare violence, trying to be as effective and active as possible, despite the shelling and the fighting, the street fighting. They've been taking care of communities with first aid capacities, trying to connect families as well that are displaced and disconnected due to the risk faced, but also dealing with the human remains that are left behind the battlefield. So it's a very fluid work. It's also aiming at avoiding to have people unaccounted for and therefore missed by their families. So there needs to be a management of that is dignified and also in line with usual procedures, but at the same time, it also is facing. They are facing as well difficulties with the capacities of the morgues and the whole system that supports it: electricity, water, etc. I'll just come back to the point earlier that was mentioned with regards to humanitarian space and ceasefire negotiation. Let me be clear: the humanitarian principles and humanitarian space should not be conditioned by political agreement. It needs to be respected right now and by all, so that basic human responses are ensured by those who can, actors on the ground, such as the Sudanese Red Crescent, the authorities, the ministers, concerned Minister of Health, so as to be able to really function in the basic of their responsibilities to help people right now that are caught between the battle and the parties to be able to survive and be respected in the same line as well. Humanitarian space is also respected when essential infrastructures are respected and spared from the attacks. And this is really urgent, and it can be done right now without waiting for a political agreement or a ceasefire. That needs to be something that parties commit today to ensure that we are efficient and we are limiting the load of this conflict on the population.
Nimot, we're talking a lot about military leaders, we're talking a lot about humanitarian efforts, but give us a sense of what it's like to be in a situation like this. I mean, you're a survivor of the genocide of Darfur. You know, we had 2.5 million people displaced by the fighting there. Give us a sense of what it's like to be involved in this environment and the type of violence and chaos and how you navigate that sort of thing.
I think the situation for the people of Darfur is unimaginable. The suffering, because these are the people who have been forced out of their homes. They remain in these makeshift camps. They continue to face with attacks, and the psychological damage alone is enough to kill more people, seeing themselves again in this situation. In 2019, the people of Darfur were hopeful that finally their plight has been recognized at the national level, that there will be a change in government, that they will see accountability, that they can be able to go home. Unfortunately, millions remain out of their home. They cannot go back because of the fact that their attackers have not yet to be held accountable or apprehended. As the former speaker mentioned, that urgent humanitarian needs need to be delivered. Humanitarian corridors need to be created. In addition to people moving into different directions, going to Egypt, Ethiopia, Chad, and potential other countries, there are many people who are cut off. And this regime, they are part of parcel of the former regime. They are used to using delaying tactic. They like to negotiate. They like to sign agreement, but they are not inclined to implement any of those agreements. You mentioned the two rivals right now, the generals who have their hands full of blood of the people of Darfur, but also other Sudanese. There is also another third element to this. There is credible allegation that the former members of the former regime, the elements, including the shadow militia right now, they are the ones who are also going out and shooting people and attacking. So that also will make it really nearly impossible for people to navigate who to bring to the table. I think the international community tend to use kind of like managing the situation rather than doing accountability. I think there is a need for more robust international pressure, but also regional pressure. I think we need to see more like African leaders stepping up. It's good that they are meeting in Saudi, but unfortunately the Saudis, Emirates, and other regional governments like Egypt are not neutral. They're the one who fueled this because of their unconditional support to both generals. So I think these are the issues that need to be addressed, provide safety for humanitarian actors to operate.
Well, let me ask you that question, Ali. Who needs to step into the void here? I mean, she's talking about there are a number of countries that could step up and actually apply pressure. Where do you see it coming from?
I think it's not one answer. There's got to be pressure from lots of different places, because clearly the pledges that have been made in the last weeks to have ceasefires, to have talks, to show restraint, haven't really shown anything sustainable or lasting. And that should be a message. That should send the clear message to everybody, whether it's the Saudis and the regional players in the Gulf, whether it's the African neighbors, whether it's the Europeans or the Americans or the Chinese or the Russians, that what these two individuals say is not something you can trust. And as a consequence of that, There needs to be an understanding that you can't just say, we'll have a phone call, we'll show that there is pressure of this kind. It's got to be much more robust. It's got to show that there are consequences for this savage violence, and it's got to show that there will be not just leaving it aside or putting it to one side, as has happened so many times in the past, that this is somehow something you can just forgive or forget, because clearly so much has happened that can't be overlooked.
Ali, one of the things that Abdullahi pointed out is you're going to have a lot of refugees spilling into adjacent countries. Chad, in fact, the UN saying you could see in the neighborhood of 250,000 people crossing into Chad in the coming weeks and months as this fighting continues. Can you talk to us about the food and shelter situation in Chad? Because Al Jazeera is reporting that the situation there is also very dire.
Well, one thing we have to remember is that Sudan, and Khartoum in particular, is a regional hub in its own right. And so Khartoum is supplying the whole country, but also to some extent neighboring countries, particularly South Sudan, but also Chad. And so the Darfur-Chad economy is very much integrated, and what happens on one side of the border affects the other. With the destruction of the markets in El Geneina, as Nimat was talking about, the violence in Nyala and El Fasher, that has implications for people in Darfur, but also people in Chad. And both of these countries are fragile. Both of these regions, Eastern Chad, Western Sudan, have many challenges, humanitarian, developmental, and so on. And so any additional pressure makes the situation on both sides much worse. It's not only Chad, it's also South Sudan, it's also Central African Republic. So the impact across the region is significant.
Abdullahi, briefly, we've only got about 20 seconds. You talked about these three options. How do we get to the point where the bloodshed ends?
I think the Gulf countries need to, I think the United States and European Union need to lean on the Gulf countries to throttle some of the money that, you know, both General Burhan and General Dagalo have been able to make. Because at this point, I think money is one thing that would make a huge difference. Because as long as they have the money, like Ali said, they don't have to listen to anybody. They can continue fighting because they can pay for it.
All right, I want to thank all of you for joining us. A great discussion. Obviously, a very sad situation in Sudan. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.